Nikola joined him 2 years later, contributing topics related to cycling and walking in Korean cities. So, without further ado, let's welcome to these two speakers tonight.
Thanks everyone, thanks for coming along on this cold night. Wasn't expecting so many people. Thank you for that introduction. So, as mentioned, I started Kojix.com in 2011, and it really just started as a project of mine, like a blog. I'd been living in Korea since 2007, and during my time here I'd kind of noticed all these projects going on around the place. You know, pretty much everywhere you look in Korea there's a construction site, there's a crane, there's always something going on. And so basically this led me to kind of investigate what these projects were, and a lot of that led me to find that a lot of them were transport related projects, especially new subway lines, cycleways, things like that. And so I just started this blog as I began looking into these projects to kind of inform people, but also to get information out there, especially to expats in Korea. I found that a lot of expats had like the wrong or incorrect information about certain projects, or they just weren't aware. And so I began writing that, and then later on Nikola came on board and we started doing it together, and it kind of grew from there. And we've kind of developed an audience from many different, not just from people in Korea, but also from people all over the world, people working in the industry, also visitors to Korea. Last year we kind of relaunched the website and made it look quite new, and we added some more things to it. So whereas before it was just kind of a blog and news, we kind of added some other things, a project database so you can search for all the different bits of transport in Korea, transport discussion forum for talking about transport, and this one, which is really important, guide to public transport in and around Korean cities. So now we get a lot of visitors who are coming to Korea. Actually, a lot of Korean websites, they haven't, if you're looking for information on Google, for example, even the Incheon International Airport, information is really hard to find through Google sometimes. And so we just want to make that information a lot easier to access. We're also active on social media. Nikola will talk about that in a sec. So this is our website, and as mentioned, we get a lot of interest from people all over the world, people reaching out to us who are also interested in Korean transport.
Yes, like Andy said, we are active on social media. That's, for example, our Facebook page, where you can maybe like post links to our most recent articles. We post links to any news articles or media articles related to transportation or development in Korea. And also we share pictures and videos on there. Also we have Twitter and Google, YouTube and Google+. And now, to start the topic, first, like as an icebreaker and to open this presentation, I want to ask you, who uses public transportation in Korea or in Seoul at least once a day? Can you please raise your hand? Okay, it's a huge majority. And then now compared to your place where you maybe previously lived or your home country, do you use public transport more? Like, who of you uses public transport more often here in Korea than they've done back home? Can you raise your hand? Okay, also it shows what I've more or less expected. So, and it's also like what our topic, our presentation is about, like public transportation, how we use it and how it developed over the years. And to understand this whole development, how everything evolved over the years, there's a very interesting concept by the transport researcher Paul Barter. He's from Australia but based in Singapore, and he does lots of studies in Asian cities or also in many other cities around the world related to transportation and parking. He made this basic concept that every city, every town, which is not a lot of economic activity, which is small and has not many places to go to, is more or less like a walking city. You have short distances, you can walk to any place you want. But then with growing prosperity, with economic activities, then people have to go somewhere. So it means walking is not enough. And usually then we will have non-motorized cities where people can use bicycles or other rickshaws, other forms of transportation. Then, if this growing demand in transportation, with growing economic activity, with growing distances, isn't met with public transportation, then we are going to end, or not end, but then we are going to develop into a motorcycle city. That you can see, for example, in Vietnam, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are very famous examples. 20 years ago, they've been non-motorized transport cities and bicycle heavens. Now they're motorcycle cities. And then, if this trend continues, we will actually end up to have our North American model of car cities, very heavy, large infrastructure that costs a lot of money, and everybody not only has a car, but everybody needs a car to get to their destinations or to the places. However, there's of course, you see there's blank, there's some alternative pathways. So from a walking city or from a non-motorized city, a city, then decision makers and policy makers, if they decide to promote public transportation and introduce buses and so on, then there's a shift possible towards bus and often paratransit, because if it's informal and still at the early stage of the development. And from there, there's still always the danger to go back into car cities, or if there's too high demand and the buses, especially bus cities, can't cope with this, then they will end up again as a car city. So it's very important to go from a bus city up to introduce mass transit, often rail-based mass transit, and then in order to become a real transit city. Also Paul Barter, the transport researcher, he categorized the Seoul of the 1950s as a non-transport city, non-motorized transport city, and then the Seoul of today he sees as a transit city. Also, our presentation today will describe this path and then only focus on public transportation. You will maybe see, we don't talk about cars, we don't talk about private motorization, because that's not actually very important in Korea, or in Seoul not. Because if public transport doesn't work, if suddenly the public transport system collapses, then the whole city collapses, but not if you don't have private cars. Then again, they're more interconnections, so it's a very complicated model in the whole. So now, to start this topic, we first will go to the past and start early 20th century.
All right, so I promise we'll have a lot more pictures now. So public transport was born in Korea in May 1899 with the Tram in Seoul. So some people are familiar with that there were trams in Seoul. Some people don't know. But the trams were started, they were actually the idea of two American businessmen, Henry Colburn and Harry Bostwick. And so they came over and they went and talked to Emperor Gojong. He was emperor at that stage because this was during the Korean Empire, just after the the Joseon dynasty. Although I put a picture of a king in there because I prefer that. So basically, Kolbrand and Bostwick, they met up with Gojong, Emperor Gojong, and they convinced him to build a tramway. They talked to him about the benefits and stuff, and so they went into a joint venture together. And part of that joint venture was also not just setting up a tram, but also setting up electric lighting in Seoul. Although it wasn't the first electric lighting in Seoul, that came a few years before that. So, when the tram opened, people went crazy basically, they loved it. The story goes that people came from all over the country to ride the tram, and there's also tales of some people giving up their livelihood, just giving up their job to just sit and ride on the tram all day, because they loved it that much. So right here is the original tram. There were 8 of them built, and plus 1 for the emperor, of course, his own private one. And so the first original tram was, it was all made of wood, no cushions or anything, very open. You can see also they also got advertising up here. This is some advertising for a Japanese medicinal pad, even back then. So yeah, it was pretty popular. But 10 days after the opening, something terrible happened. With so many people fascinated by the tram, there were a lot of people on the streets. And while Seoul streets were busy at that time already with people and cattle and horse and carts and things, people weren't used to big vehicles coming down the road. And a 5-year-old kid ran out in front of the tram and was hit and tragically killed. Now, of course, there were a lot of people on the road at the time who witnessed this, and they all went into a mob, into a frenzy. The father of the child went after the driver with an axe, and although I think he got away, but the crowd did burn the tram to the ground. And then after that, I think they moved on. They went to attack the generator that they didn't get there. So yeah, I think there's a picture of the. So this is kind of known as like the first accident, first public transport accident in Korea. So that's the picture of the burnt out tram on the road. And so this was kind of a new site which people saw. This is another one I just added in there from 1936 where a car got completely squished between 2 of the trams. But the trams went on to be very successful, and in 1909, before the Japanese fully took over, in 1909, Kolbrand went into talks with the Japanese to sell the tram, and he sold the tram to the Japanese without telling the emperor. And when the emperor found out about this, he was furious, but by that time Kolbrand had gone back to London where he was originally from, because he immigrated to the US earlier on. But nothing much changed after that. The trams did go on to continue to be successful. And this is a map of what the tram network was like in 1936. So you'll recognize a lot of these names. You've got like Seoul Station, City Hall, Itaewon, Noryangjin, Yeongbun-po, a lot of these major places in Seoul. And so it was really quite a good developed network. In 1937, there were about, I think, 150,000 passengers a day. And while there were originally about 8 trams when they first started, later on they had about 150, I think. And Seoul wasn't the only city. Also Busan, they had trams for quite a long time as well. And then also at that time Pyongyang too had trams from 1923 to 1950 when the Korean War began. And then they actually, trams came back to Pyongyang in 1991, and they're still running today. that's not to be confused with the trolley buses that run in Pyongyang as well. They started in 1962. But back to Seoul. This is some of the trams after the Japanese left after World War II. So I think this is just before the Korean War up here. And these other two are from 60s. So you can see the trams themselves, the vehicles, they developed quite a bit as well. Here's another one, 1963. And some of you might have seen this tram just down the road there, the Seoul Museum of History. That tram is from the 1930s, from the Japanese era. And it's been restored, and that's a permanent display outside the Seoul Museum of History. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go check it out. It's a good piece of history. I'll pass it on now to Nikola.
So yes, the tram was the most important public transport at that time. But if you looked at some pictures like directly after the liberation from Japan, before the Korean War, but there was a lot of people walking and cycling in the city. So also here there's this survey result where it leaves out tram. So maybe tram would make up 40%, and then the other shares would be a little bit less. But according at least to this survey on main boulevards of Seoul, here walking, still many people are just on foot, and then cycling. Also you can see like here the bicycle is inside this picture. So it was still like this, what I introduced earlier, like a non-motorized city with transport for quite a number of people, but not for everyone. And then there was the Korean War. After the Korean War, the cities had to be reconstructed, the roads had to be repaired, the first expansions began, the first highway construction also then began in the 60s and 70s. And there was also like a time where buses have been introduced, taxi licenses have been distributed to operators, and suddenly, also here still, now we have also buses coming. They existed before. The Japanese introduced buses in the 1930s, but still like, you can see a bicycle in this picture. Then, just after the first survey, now 20 years later, we had lots of changes. And here you can see how the buses are dominating. So it says public transport in 1965, but actually like taxi is not official public transport until today. It's not public transport, but here it was included in the survey. And tram tram decreased heavily and made only like less than a quarter of trips. The majority of trips were then already made by bus. 1968 was the year when the tram service was discontinued. That's the last picture we will see a traditional tram, mostly out of the reasons that the city believed trams are too slow, they are not attractive enough, they don't provide the service needed for the city, and they've been more seen as obstacle. They disturbed the traffic flow, because now we had many taxis, we had lots of buses. We didn't have, at this time, there was no private motorization. It came a decade later, like 10 years later. But then, still you can, and they saw like here, we need the space actually for other transport modes, not for tram. So up until the first subway opening, it was the so-called era of buses, because it was more or less the only public transport method. And then, probably you know about this, the female, like Anne-Youngs, the female conductors, they've been more or less like the heart and the soul of this old-fashioned bus system. So they took care of collecting the fares, they took care of the bus departing or stopping, so they, also a little bit funny, they screamed stop, like the English expression stop, to make the bus driver stop. or all-right, or like all-right is like communist type, like Korean translation, to make the bus, like the bus driver start again and go on with this ride. And then this was actually a very popular job. It was so-called one of the female jobs. I really don't like this expression, but for this period it was like a job for women more or less, and they recruited over 17,000 women throughout the years for this job. It didn't pay too well, but it was more or less because of like the requirements relatively low, and because Korean War and many people couldn't afford to go to school or couldn't like the circumstances allowed, so it was an opportunity for many women to be economically active and to work. But then, still, the bus service was not able to cope with this increase of population, with the growth of Seoul or also other cities in Korea. So the bus service heavily decreased in quality. There was a lot of waiting, a lot of huge crowds, and it was like not really the best service.
So, buses weren't cutting it, and they needed another solution. So subways, of course. There actually had been plans during the 60s, I think during the 50s and even as far back as the 40s, for subway lines in Seoul, but they just kind of sat on the table and nothing happened to them. Until a mayor came along, Mayor Young Taek-shi, and he was previously the head of the National Korean Railroad. So he knew the importance of rail, and he got started on this pretty much straight away, building Line 1 from 1971 to 1974. So you can see City Hall there, and Line 1 being constructed. And it was opened in August 1974, which was supposed to be a day with a whole lot of events and festivities. But on the day of the opening, the First Lady was assassinated, and so it kind of cast a shadow over. This was probably the only event they held on the day. And so it opened actually rather quietly. What is Line 1? So first of all, you notice it's red, because back then that was the colour of the line. It was also known as the Jongno Line. 7.8 kilometres underground, and even though this was the subway section, at that time it still did connect to the rest of what we know as Line 1 today, going out to Incheon, down to Suwon, and also up to Songpo, which is today Kwangwon University Station. Now, the underground section and the rest of the line, they use different electricity. So if you've ever ridden on Line 1, you'll notice that before you go into underground, the lights turn off, and then come back on again. That's because it's switching electricity systems from 25,000 volt AC electricity, which KoRail uses for their rail network, to the 1,500 volt DC network underground. Now, when it opened, in the first month there were 497 delays and faults, so it didn't go that smoothly, but it was still fairly well received because it connected people in the kind of satellite cities. Obviously the purpose of the line was to kind of get people out of their cars, reduce pollution a bit, stop people, because people were just moving to Seoul at this stage. Population was exploding. and it continued to explode, and it doubled between the 1960s and 1970s. From 255,000 to over 550,000. And so after Line 1 opened in 1974, that mayor, he left, and a new mayor came in. His name was Gu Chun. So Mayor Gu, he was tasked with Line 2, which is, when you think of the subway in Seoul, you really think of Line 2. Now he got started on this. At that time, there weren't really detailed plans for Line 2. All they knew was that they wanted a loop. And so Mayor Gu, he came in and put a map on the table, got a coloured pencil, and he just went, oh yeah, we'll put it through here, through here, through here, through here. And in 20 minutes, he drew what we know today as Line 2. And surprisingly, they built it that way, and it wasn't too bad. So, probably looked like something like this. Now, even though it was a loop, it was built in stages. It wasn't built all at once, so it was opened over nearly 4 years, from 1980. And it started out from Shinseodong. So in 1983, it looked like this. And obviously this Shinseodong part here today is a little spur off. It's not actually part of the loop. The reason for that is because they needed to bring in vehicles from the railroad, and so that connected to Line 1 up there. So they continued to build it, and it was opened, the full loop was opened in 1984. And today it's the most used subway line, 200 million passengers a day, and 30% of all subway travel happens on Line 2. With some of the busiest stations as well, Shindoring Station and Gangnam Station, two really extremely busy stations. Now, I think it was 1982, Seoul Metro came along and they began operating the underground section of Line 1, they began operating Line 2, and they picked up the plans for Line 3 and 4, and they finished construction on that, and they both opened on the same day in 1985. So that's how they all opened up. So in 1990, this is how it looked, and which is, it's pretty good compared to what they had 10 years ago. Pretty good progress. And the next plan was to build lines 5 to 8. And so that, from construction to full opening, that took around 10 years. Now I won't go through every single line that has opened since then, because we'll be here forever. But I just want to really emphasize how important, the subway system is to Seoul. It's really the lifeline of Seoul that makes up the largest modal share, 37.1%. Compare this to my city of Auckland, where I'm from, where that would be completely the other way around. Cars would be up top. So I think it's a pretty impressive number. One thing that surprised me in Korea is how even small delays on the Seoul subway network make news headlines. There was a 10-minute delay, it makes news headlines. In New Zealand, the train can be cancelled and they'll do headlines. So it's also the 6th longest network in the world, and will soon, in my opinion, it will soon be the 5th, taking over Moscow, because it just continues to grow. If the Seoul Metro network, for some freak reason shut down, it would be absolute chaos, basically. The number of passengers that use it each day is just phenomenal.
Yes, and in the meantime, let's get back to the sad story of the buses. So now, subway took the majority of trips, the service of buses decreased through the decades. You can see here how this downwards trend from 70s up until like it's now 95, but then Andy showed the previous slide, it even went down to 28%, or really to the second most important public transport mode in Korea. And there have been lots of issues in the 1970s with buses, and it was a huge financial burden for the city. So if you spend a lot of money on such service, and then some of the solutions or ways to solve this issue is then by privatizing this service. So Seoul, they've done this. They privatized the service in 1972, but it actually made things worse. Here, this picture is not only about the issues of buses. In the 1990s, we had a peak of cars in Seoul, like the car ownership rapidly increased, and we had cars everywhere. The big show also of driving cars in Seoul during that time, or until today, it's everybody sits alone in their car. Everybody's driving alone. It's taking a lot of space. But back in the 1990s, you can see where's the bus stop. The bus stop is here, somewhere on the right. But the buses, they can't even access, even if they wanted to. But actually, they didn't even want to get close to the bus stop. Because, so you have to understand, the buses have been operated by private companies, and passengers means money. The more passengers they get, the more money they earn. And the victims of this system were then elderly and young children. So like elderly because they take a lot of time to get on the bus, and the bus driver didn't even thought about waiting for them. He just took as much fit people, and then tried to overtake the other buses to get first to the next bus stop in order to get more people on the bus. And then another issue is also if it's privately run, they can choose wherever they want to operate. Of course, then they choose the main streets, the main big roads, where they can expect lots of passengers, but no bus went to the outskirts or to areas where there are less people, or maybe more people who need public transport, don't have cars, anything, or other alternatives. So, in order to solve this issue, then Seoul took it again back, again from this private organized bus system, they took it again into public hands. And that's more or less, it's now we come to the second part of our presentation, to the present. What we have until today, what we can see until today, is the so-called public transport reform. It was implemented in 2004. They done previous reforms in 97, and that failed in 97. They've done trial runs of this public transport reform in 2003 in one small area, but it failed as well. But then the implementation of the whole of the system in the whole city was quite successful. And now, into this reform, Seoul took it back into their hands. They decided where buses have to operate, and which frequency, and how many services are each day until what time of day. While private companies just had to take care of the buses, maintaining the buses, paying the drivers, collecting the fares, but the fares were then also even then the third entity, the smart cards company, who then distributed the money, including subsidies, in order to make the system profitable. And then this public transport reform had 4 main features. The first one, medium bus lanes. So these days, to this reform in 2004, in order to get on some buses, we don't take the bus on the side of the road. We have to get on the center of the road, on the small islands, like platforms, and from there take bus. And the good thing is, even if there's traffic, the bus usually then just has their own lane and can pass by all this car traffic. This system is the so-called bus rapid transit, BRT system. and it was first introduced in 1974 in the Brazilian city of Curitiba. And Seoul, they looked at Curitiba, and which is like best practice of this bus rapid transit, and they then took this concept of the median bus lanes. Here you can see the similarities. Like they also have median bus lanes. Here, even the streets are very wide. It's a city with 1 million people, so and a lot of space, so they can even have 2 lanes per direction. The difference here is, for example, here you pay, like in Curitiba, you pay to get into the platform, and you don't pay when you get on the bus. So it resembles more like a subway system. You enter the system here, then you get on the bus, and then you can transfer easily between buses. Korea didn't do this, first of all, because there's not a complete network of the system. You know, sometimes the buses still take passengers from the side of the road, and then when the system was introduced in 2004, we already had smart card system, which is actually quite a quick way to pay for public transportation. The second feature of this reform is the color coding and the categories of buses. You now, as you all know, like blue, green, red, and yellow buses. The yellow buses are they have just dozens of them, where like circular buses in very small areas. Blue buses are the so-called trunk buses. They go through half of the city, almost from one end to another. The green buses are so-called feeder buses. They feed into the subway system. So they pass by as many subway stops as possible. So I would also recommend you, if you are lost and you just want to find the subway system as fast as possible, just get on a green bus, and it will lead you more or less to at least 1 or 2 stations. And then the red buses are connecting Seoul and outer cities of Seoul. And this system is also taken from Curitiba. Curitiba, they have the same color coding. They also use the same blue buses for, they even have articulated buses, something that we don't have here in Seoul. But red buses for the express buses, like also green for the district buses, and so on. The third element is the smart card system. So now we have just a card to pay for everything, and not only public transport, bus, but also for convenience stores, or for any or even for taxi or phone booths and so on. And actually, Seoul was the first city in the world to introduce a chip-based payment system for public transportation. And that was already in 1996 with the U-Pass. It was like the first kind in the world. And since then, the smart card system is a little bit an upgraded version of this, because it's integrated and can be used anywhere. And it's even exported to many cities around the world, to New Zealand and to South America and many other places. The fourth element is the real-time information system. It's probably for the user one of the most important things, because if you compare, several studies comparing, if you don't know when your bus arrives and you know when your bus arrives, the waiting time, for when you don't know, is much longer and it's more uncomfortable. You really don't know when it will come, and it's very inconvenient. So knowing it will come in 4 minutes feels really good. And or knowing, actually it doesn't operate yet because it's a night bus, so during the day it's not yet operating. Real-time information system, there's a whole control center, so-called topless system. I've never been there actually. I would love to go there once, but it looks really amazing. And they not only manage bus system or bus times, they manage the whole traffic, or construction sites and all the traffic flow, speeds. They have all information in this, and then they distribute it. They make it possible for us to have it on the smartphone or on the internet, on the website, and so on. So that's the result of this public transport reform. The official name is public transport reform, but it was more like a bus reform. Except for the smart card system, that was also introduced for subways. Most of the measures are aimed to improve the bus system, to improve the bus service. And so it was, as I said, 2004, somewhere around here. And the only thing you could see, like after it's decreasing for many years, now the share of buses is more or less stabilized. And since then it's on a relatively same level. Because there's still like a lot of issues. For example, as I said earlier, there's medium bus lanes, so there should be a network of medium bus lanes. They're not connected well. Here, this map, or this light blue or yellow or red sections are actually gaps in the system, and they don't exist yet. And it says completed in this year, but they're not completed. They're not even being planned. So to have a real, BRT medium bus lane network, you need to connect all of these different routes and different major roads. And then this is not a problem these days anymore, but it was at the beginning. They changed to this new system without reducing the number of buses, and because the bus was still very important, and there have been so many operators who still wanted to be part of this new system. There were like huge traffic jams on this lane. So also it shows a little bit the limitation of what buses can actually move and transport. And even there's some funny pictures, like saying maybe it's not, even the players, Lehman Buck, who the one who introduced this public transit reform, that is saying it's not. Isn't it maybe just a defense wall in StarCraft or anything? So it's not. Is it really moving? It's kind of making jokes of it. And then the underlying reason for all of this, and why we have subway systems, and what now Andy is going to also introduce to us, is because buses have limitations and limited capacity. So while private cars are of course the worst in terms of how many people can be moved per hour, and cycling is actually quite well, and if you look at cost, it's the best mode because you don't have much infrastructure. But the buses are somewhere here, and then a real mass transit subway or dedicated rail, even on the streets, can move much more people than just a normal bus system.
Alright, so again, buses have improved, but still not always the answer. Now you might have noticed in the past few years around Korea, with some lines opening up, that they're not necessarily subway or even rail lines. Since 2011, 7 or 8 different light rail lines around the country have actually opened. It's more than normal, standard subway or rail lines. So there's been a real rise of light rail around the country. Now the first one that was set to open was the spectacular failure that was the Medimorec. Now this was a project that was supposed to open in 2010, I believe. It was supposed to rejuvenate the Medimorec area, which was getting a bit aged, and people weren't going there as much as they did. And so people were pretty excited for this. And it was kind of plagued with problems from the start, problems during testing, and then the final nail in the coffin was during a test. A bit of the monorail fell off and injured a woman. All of my stories involve people getting injured, don't they? And finally, earlier this year, this photo is from August this year, it was finally removed without operating even once, even though it was completed in 2010. But not all hope is lost. This funny looking thing is going to replace it, so rather than a vehicle which can take many people, some type of tourist venture has, I guess, said, hey, we can do something with this. And that's so that they're going to try and use the line. So that's supposed to be opening next year, but yeah, again, we'll see. Now the next one that was supposed to open after that was the Everline, which was also completed 2010, didn't open until 2013. Just sat there, hanging over the city for 3 years, doing nothing because of problems between the city and the companies. So light rail actually didn't really get off to a great start. These are the new lines that have been opened over the past few years, since 2011. Obviously, Busan were doing right. They opened the first two in the same year, Busan Line 4, and they came out Busan Light Rail Transit. And you can see the other ones there, Uijeongbu Line, Yongin Line, Suncheon PRT, Daegu Monorail. Now I've got Incheon Maglev, and some of you might say, hey, that's not light rail, and that's right, I haven't ridden light rail there. But it's still a different type of technology, other than the subway. So let's have a look at what types of light rail they are, because light rail is actually a really loose definition. So when people think of light rail normally, it's usually this type of thing. Above ground, this thing is called AGT, Automatic Guided Transit, and you can see it, and this is Busan Lines 4. There's two types. You've got the rubber wheeled, which are used in Uijeongbu as well, and then you've got steel wheeled. This is the new Incheon Line 2, which opened, which has also been plagued with problems, but I think still operating okay. Everline is also one of these ones. Daegu, for their Line 3, they decided not to build a subway and went for a monorail. And it's pretty good, I think. It's about 23 kilometres long and weaves in and out through the buildings. So if you're in Daegu, it's be pretty good to see the city. The maglev, which I mentioned, obviously moves using magnets, magnetic levitation. It kind of goes nowhere. It's free to ride. The aim of the project is for it to go to a tourist area on Yeongjongdo where the airport is, but still being built. Now, some people, when they think of maglev, they think of super fast trains, but that's why this is called an urban maglev. It's more of a maglev designed for an urban environment. PRT, Personal Rapid Transit. This funny little thing, SkyCube, is in Suncheon. It was built for the World Garden Expo, held a couple of years ago down there, and it wasn't ready in time for the expo, unfortunately. But they did manage to get it open temporarily, I think, halfway through, and then officially opened it again later. So this is another good example of Korea actually experimenting using different technologies. There's not actually too many PRT systems in operation around the world. So, now speaking of technologies, one thing you'll notice about these new lines that are popping up is that they're all automated. There's no one driving them. And this isn't limited just to light rail. Also the Shinpundang line from Gangnam, which goes down to Pundang and also Suwon now. That's automated too. And Korea's really getting good at this. And it's actually second worldwide in terms of automated lines. And again, they're going to come first soon because Korea has just signed an MOU with Hyundai Rotem to automate some of their lines. They didn't say which ones, but for example, maybe the Suwon line from Suwon to Incheon, maybe they'll automate that. So yeah, I think more and more we're going to see less drivers and more automated systems. But why the change to light rail? Well, it's difficult to pinpoint it exactly, especially because there's a lot of different types of light rail. It really depends. Generally, it's going to be lower cost. It can be up to a third cheaper in some cases. They use less energy, reduce noise too, construction time, and more efficient. So even though sometimes with light rail the vehicles are maybe smaller, they might operate in more frequent intervals. Especially for some of these cities, heavy rail can be a bit, too much for the city, whereas buses still don't cut it. So light rail is a good compromise in the middle. For the future. So there's a lot of cool projects coming up in Korea. This isn't one of them. But yeah, one thing we do at Kojix is we look at what's coming up, and we get really excited about these things happening. One thing to know about future projects in Korea is that a lot of the time they'll say, hey, this is opening in 2 years, and it will open 5 years later. So it always pays to be cautious when, especially if you're thinking of buying land or something involving, obviously people try and buy land around future subway lines and stuff. Make sure the plans are confirmed before you go ahead with that, because very often plans do get changed or even cancelled. Now there was one type of light rail we hadn't talked about, and that's trams. Back to trams. Now there's quite a few cities actually looking at bringing the tram back. So following from light rail's rise, we're now seeing some cities looking at trams, and one that is confirmed to open in 2018 is the Pangyo tram route. So this will be the first one. We're going according to plan. It's a very short one, but it'll definitely help the workers in Pangyo get from the station to their offices. And so this tram will run through kind of the pedestrian areas. So it won't necessarily be it'll cross roads, but it won't be a long road. Actually, it'll be going around pedestrian areas. Daejeon have confirmed that their line 2 is not going to be a subway. It's not going to be a maglev, which was also suggested. It's going to be a tram. This was a controversial decision down there. A lot of people were against it. People are kind of scared of trams. They're also scared of losing road space, drivers. But they've gone ahead with it, and eventually it will be a loop. Uyghur Shinsa line is a planned one for Seoul, going through the heart of Gangnam actually, and looking up to the Hanam city, the Uyghur Shindoshi, Uyghur New City. This one is planned, but a company just pulled out, and another company said they're going to try and help. So yeah, again, you just got to keep your eye on it. Suwon said that they want to build a tram. Still nothing's happened with it, but hopefully they do. Incheon also said they want to build a tram. And also Dongtan. This one's looking a bit more promising. There's an article recently saying they're looking at starting construction in a couple of years. So it's really interesting to see these cities coming back to trams. Obviously the technology is a lot different now, and they look a lot better, work a lot better than they did in the old days. So it would be definitely great to see them back. Now for a couple of other projects coming up. This one isn't your typical public transport, this is more national rail, but I thought I'd bring it up today. High-speed rail in Gangnam is opening next month. Tickets actually went on sale today, and it's called the SRT. And it's operated by company SR, which is a subsidiary of Korea. And it means that you can now get KTX type trains from Susa in Gangnam to Busan or Gwangju, Mokpo. So I know that when I lived in Gangnam, it was a real pain to get up to Seoul Station whenever I got the train. So it's definitely going to be a big help. There are also plans to extend that to Samsung Station, where COEX is. as well. Seoul has a lot of plans as well. What this image up here shows is kind of areas where you can walk to a subway station within 10 minutes. So there's a lot of gaps there, they want to fill those gaps in. So again, they're planning a lot of lines, but some of these are still quite far off. Nevertheless, there are still quite a few projects opening in the next 2 years. Colonial line in Busan, which is just basically commuter rail. Seoul's getting its first light rail line. Until now, all the light rail has been in other cities, not actually in Seoul. So that's going from Shinseol, Dong to Uri area. That funny Wamido monorail thing. Rail to Pyeongchang, very important for the Olympics, which will mean trains straight from the airport to Pyeongchang. And they better hope they can get that done on time. And Sosa to Wonshi, the line in Gyeonggi-do, and Kimpo. City of Kimpo, there's a lot of development there. They're also getting their own subway line. So those are all the brand new things just in 2 years. That's excluding all the extensions to current lines that are also planned. So there's always a ton of stuff going on. So if you're ever curious, please, check our website. We try to update it when we can.
We started with showing pictures from the tram in Seoul and other places in Korea, and also we want to conclude this presentation with showing a picture of a possible, or let's say, not really possible, but a future model or future picture of a tram in Seoul. So the Seoul Institute actually developed a couple of years ago this concept of reintroducing trams on the streets of Seoul, and then will be included with wider sidewalks and more public spaces. And it's more or less now we came like a full circle from, we started the presentation with talking about the old tram in Seoul, how we moved to bus, into subways, and now we have this very special and unique mix of buses and subways running together. But as Andy shows, the future is more or less now light rail is introduced. Buses are going to decrease in the future, and maybe, who knows, I don't know if this concept, I really love this concept because it's more like a human scale, it's more for the user, because not everything is about efficiency, about moving fast through the city, it's also about experience and that adventure of traveling through the neighborhoods. And the tram, or like on street public transport, is one of the most exciting ways, in my opinion. So yeah, let's see whenever this comes, maybe even 2100 or something or later. So, thank you very much for listening to us. Follow us on Facebook and such things, and we are open to any questions. Yes, are there any questions?
My question is about finances and money. Where do the funds come from to do all of this construction? And are the public transportation systems underwritten? I mean, when we get on and we pay our fare, does it break even? Does it make a profit, or does it also have to be subsidized?
I'll talk a little bit. Funding really depends on what type of project it is. Some of them are completely government funded with a mix of, so for example, from the central government, from the city, from the district, and so it won't just be one place covering the whole cost. Other times, recently, there's actually been a lot more privately funded lines. So for example, you've got like line 9 in Seoul, which is a private company. The Shin Fundang line as well is also a private company, even though they're integrated into the network. That's the reason why Line 9 had issues with people paying more to ride on it. And there was a big fuss about that actually. Line 9 the opening was delayed because they couldn't set the price. So there were just issues with that. With whether the cost is already covered, and I was just going to say with CoRail, CoRail has been in a big major deficit for many years. Transport prices here are quite cheap compared to other cities, and if they're put up, people get angry. But yeah, it's a real deficit.
And probably thinking of public transit systems that make profit in the world, not only Korea. The only thing I can think of is Hong Kong. Hong Kong makes a lot of profit with the metro system because they own land and they develop this land. They then give this to tenants, like shopping malls, and they own like all department stores. Like the metro company owns all metro stores, and so they make more money, not so much through collecting fares and such things. And in my personal opinion, I think public transport is not there to make a profit. It's more like a public good. It's more like a basic public. For me, moving or having mobility is a basic human right, and we should be allowed to, or like able to travel wherever we want by using public transportation. And if the system wouldn't exist, then we all would have need to put down money for a car. We would have need to park this car, and we would cost so much more money than actually, and even like the environmental issues. So the loss, like the financial loss that Seoul makes, they still get a lot of other kind of benefits, social benefits. By, for example, like elderly, they ride for free. It's a huge minus for the city, but it allows elderly to be socially, economically still active in certain ways. And then environmentally, it reduces the pollution. That's still worse, but it reduces like many of the negative impacts that we would have been much worse if we didn't have public transportation. Yeah.
The companies are making a fuss because those of us who are 65 in Korea get free rides. Do you know anything about that? So they want to raise the limit to 70, because they are losing out. I mean, they are definitely not making profit.
Yes, it's
Do you think that will work? Will the age go up?
I think it's same as this, raise the retirement age in many countries and this kind of things. And still, they try to decrease a little bit the financial burden, but also like from a previous statement, I think, in my personal opinion, they shouldn't do it. I think subsidy-based system, it has to be, and there's also much more subsidies that we put into private cars. And even though we pay a lot. I think raising the age limit from 65 to 70, and then maybe later, who knows, to when, even more, it's not the best thing. It's more advantageous to give subsidies to have more this kind of benefits.
Yeah, I have seen the attitude of some younger people advocating that people who currently get free rides should be paying at least something because they know about this loss. But yeah, in my opinion is the same as Nikola's actually. I think it's actually a really great thing about Korea that the elderly can ride the subway for free here.
can just point out, it's Koreans above 65
Ah.
free travel.
Yes.
My brother Anthony here.
I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I come from the UK and we take an inordinate amount of time to cycle and to build new train lines because we have public inquiries and all that sort of thing. I don't get a sense, but I'm speaking from ignorance, that there's a lot of consultation that goes on with various stakeholders before lines are built here. Am I wrong there? Because one advantage, of course, is that things get done pretty quickly, but a disadvantage could be that there's impact on things like the environment. So how does that work here?
I personally actually think the opposite, because in New Zealand, where I'm from, it takes forever to build something or to get a project done, because there's too much consultation.
Exactly, that's my
Yeah,
problem.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I may not have made that.
Yeah,
That's my
so,
problem in the UK.
Here, I think there's kind of less consultation and kind of let's get on with it.
But are there stakeholders who sit there and think, why didn't you ask me?
Oh yeah. And then there's always, so for example, I talked about before on Hedge on the tram and stuff. People have been protesting about that in the street. So there are definitely people who get unhappy when some of these lines just kind of go ahead or aren't as they were originally promised. In Korea, there's definitely a let's just get it done.
Can you see that changing anytime soon?
Will it slow down with more consultation?
Yeah, or that's not going to happen anytime soon?
I feel there might have been a bit more recently. What do you think?
The current mayor, Park Won-soon, is this good example of, he says open ear, and he has like this posters with this ear, so he tries to consult more with the citizens and with people. So I think maybe, and others, because he's such a popular leader, so other mayors, other political leaders are following his approach and at least trying to have a better image and trying to pretend to be more. And also, like regarding your point, from my personal experience, I live since a couple of years close to the Shimbundang line, so already I saw the construction and everything. I saw it slowly popping up, and somehow the most important consultation from the point of people who lived there was the name of the station. So people could actually submit their ideas how to name the stations, and they had some kind of course not the final decision, but they could, have some influence on the name. Because then the name is also something very important. It can decide about if the real estate prices or like the price there increase or maybe decrease, if the name is something bad or if it's associated with something, prosperity or something good. It has lots of influence. There was like huge, in my area, huge battle of naming the station Kwangyo, York, and then there was another station that also wanted to name, had the same name, which is actually closer to Kwangyo, and we are not so much Kwangyo actually, like Kwangyo Shindoshi and the northern part of Suwon. But somehow we got the name, I don't know why, and then and so the other area was angry about this.
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. These days there are a ton of naming competitions for new lines. It's happened the same thing with the new high-speed rail, the SRT. They also put out surveys and consultation for that. Also for things like the app. So not necessarily the actual building of the line, but other elements that there seems to be a lot more consultation going on. It's funny that Nikola mentions about the name of the station. Our most popular article was on our website was the change of the name of Shincheonyeok to I actually forget the new name now. Chamshi. Can somebody remember it? Chamshi. No, it wasn't Chamshi Naru. That was another one that changed. But basically, the residents there, they didn't want the name Shincheon anymore because it didn't have Chamshi in it. So they wanted Chamshi in the name of their station because again, it raises house prices. Yeah, that's the stuff which people seem to be more worried about.
I have a question about the self-driving car and car sharing in the future. I have read article about 20 years later, probably the position of the cars will decrease 50% to, well, in the future, 20 years later. Probably car sharing and the self-driving car also huge impact to our transportation system as well as environment. What kind of impact to that self-driving car and the car sharing to our transportation system and the environment in the future? What is your opinion?
Actually, there have been studies saying, like there are studies saying 90%, like automated driving, automated cars could take off 90% of our car traffic from the roads. Everything would be completely shared, and 90% is a lot. It's not really clear when it will come, maybe 10 years, 20 years, faster than maybe imagined for many people. The thing probably still a huge issue in Korea is road safety, the number of accidents, and then this would, I think, drastically, if we would really implement a full automated driving environment where nobody's driving anymore, like not a mixed environment, where really everything's automated. It would completely, like in utopia, like limit, make the human error disappear, and we would not have any major accidents anymore. Like still every day there are hundreds of accidents in Korea. Like, compared to other OECD countries, still has Korea's high accident rates and highest fatality and highest injury rates. So that's, I think, probably the biggest impact that we will see. Then I think like car ownership, that we don't need to actually own the cars anymore, but that's also something for the future, and it all depends a lot on how the policymakers decide. And then the third impact probably also environmental. If automated vehicles are more like electric vehicles, then it would be good for the environment. And even if they are fuel-based vehicles, then still, because automated, they would be more efficient about driving and then make a better job about this. So maybe it also save fuel.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, we have to be out of here by 9 o'clock, so short.